Welcome back to Historical Chubb, where we explore some of the strangest, most unexpected, and downright unbelievable events from the past. Have you ever heard of a time when an entire nation went to war against birds? Yes, real, feathered emus, with long necks and an appetite for destruction. Today we dive headfirst into the bizarre chapter of Australian history known as the Great Emu War of 1932. An event so peculiar, you'll have to hear it to believe it. To truly understand why on earth Australia would declare war on the emus, we need to rewind to the early 1930s. Australia, like much of the world, was still reeling from the after effects of World War I and the onset of the Great Depression. Many Australian veterans had been offered farmland in Western Australia as part of the government's soldier settlements. It was supposed to be a fresh start for these returning servicemen, many of whom had fought on grim battlefields overseas. But life in the outback wasn't easy. The soil was often poor, the rainfall unpredictable, and the market prices for wheat and other crops were far from stable. And add to that, a massive emu population, over 20,000 according to some estimates, looking for food and water. These large flightless birds found the farmers' fields and water sources irresistible. Picture acres of farmland covered in tall, brown, awkwardly running emus, devouring precious crops and trampling fences. Emus, for those who might not know, are second largest living birds by height, dwarfed by only ostriches. They can sprint at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, and their surprisingly tough, thick plumage, powerful legs, and uncanny ability to adapt to harsh conditions. They move in large flocks, making them a formidable nuisance for farmers whose livelihoods depend on every last bit of grain. With crops being destroyed and fences being battered, the farmers turned to the government for help, demanding action to protect their land and their financial future. The government in turn turned to the most logical solution they could think of: the military. In November 1932, the Australian government dispatched a small contingent of soldiers led by Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery. Armed with Lewis machine guns and about 10,000 rounds of ammunition, their mission was straightforward on paper: reduce the emu population and protect the farmland. After all, these were well-trained servicemen, some of whom had real battlefield experience. However, as they were about to learn, the outback conditions and the wily nature of the emus posed challenges that typical battle strategy could not foresee. Their first encounter with the emus turned into a fiasco. On November 2nd, the soldiers located a group of about 50 emus, lined up their machine guns, and opened fire. But the birds scattered almost immediately, disappearing into the brush with only a handful of casualties. The rest were gone. Over the next few days, soldiers tried different tactics, attempting to ambush the birds near dams and waterholes, but the emus seemed to outsmart them at every turn. The machine guns jammed occasionally, leaving soldiers cursing as the birds raced away unscathed. Meredith would later remark on the birds' ability to survive multiple gunshots and keep running, calling them incredibly hardy. The following weeks saw more attempts, more ambushes, and more frustration. Each time, small numbers of emus were killed, but the majority of the flock would disperse, making it virtually impossible to cause significant damage to the population. On top of that, the terrain was rough and the weather uncooperative, meaning soldiers often couldn't get a clear shot or transport their heavy machine guns efficiently. Newspapers around the country began to cover the operation, dubbing it the Emu War. Headlines mocked the seemingly fruitless efforts of the Australian military, comparing the soldiers' tactical failings with the cunning of the giant birds. Public sentiment was mixed. Some farmers believed the war was necessary to protect their livelihoods, while others found the entire endeavor laughable and even cruel. One of the more famous quotes from the operation was attributed to a soldier who joked that if they ever wanted to hand out medals, they should give them all to the emus, because they had conducted themselves like cavalry. Meanwhile, the Australian government, embarrassed by the media coverage, eventually decided to withdraw the troops and end the campaign. The official reason was that the operation was not as effective as hoped, and the PR wasn't exactly positive. By the time the military pulled out, estimates vary on how many emus were actually culled. Maybe a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand, but it was nowhere near enough to put a dent in the overall population. And the destruction of crops persisted. Farmers continued to complain, and eventually the government switched strategies, providing bounties on emu scalps, improving fences, and supporting local solutions rather than relying on heavy-handed military intervention. The Great Emu War remains a surreal footnote in Australian history, a moment when soldiers fresh off global conflict found themselves humiliated by an army of flightless birds. It also underscores the challenges of settling in the harsh Australian environment and the unexpected obstacles that can arise when humans clash with wildlife.